Hi, welcome to my home and to my channel. I'm Debbie, and yes, I'm coming from the Pacific Northwest where I live, and I am also offering you a weekly episode on something good about all the generations, the seniors, the Gen Zers, and everybody in between. So come along with me and let's get started.
Woke up this morning feeling fine. There's something special on my mind. Last night I met a new girl in the neighborhood. Whoa, yeah. Something tells me I'm into something good. Something tells me I'm into something. She's the kind of girl who's not too shy, and I can tell I'm her kind of guy. She danced close to me like I hope she would. She danced for me like I hope she would. Something tells me I'm into something good. Something tells me I'm into something. We only danced for a minute or two, and then she stuck close to me the whole night through. Can I be the one in love? For she's everything I've been dreaming of. She's everything I've been dreaming of. I walked her home and she held my hand. I knew it couldn't be just a one night stand. So I asked to see her next week, and she told me I could. I asked to see her and she told me I could. Something tells me I'm into something good. Something tells me I'm into something. Something tells me I'm into something.
Hi, welcome back to another exciting week and episode. In fact, this is season 1, episode 2. And the title of my episode is, are you ready for this? Debbie was a Beatlemaniac. That's right, I was a Beatlemaniac. But what does that mean? Well, tune in, let's find out. But before we start on this week's episode topic, I just want to let you know a few things. Last week I talked way too long, and I realized, I've got to change things up a little bit. So instead of a 30-minute episode, we're going to keep these at 20 minutes. That's one thing. Also, last week the comments button was not enabled at the time, but now it will be. So hopefully you'll leave some nice comments for me. Another thing I'd like to mention to you, so that you'll know what to do with each episode. At the beginning, as you noticed, there was about a 2-minute video. That was my title, where you have the music and you see me introducing and let's get started. That will be the beginning of every episode. It's the same thing. If you'd rather not see that, if you'd rather just fast forward, you can do that and start with my speaking into the camera. It's up to you. It's all good. Anyway, let's get back to my topic. Were you a Beatlemaniac? I sure was. First of all, let me say this. I am not reinventing the wheel here. Of course, your grown kids or grandkids, no matter where you were at the time of the Beatles, or maybe you weren't even born yet, some of you viewers. The point is, you can look yourself on all kinds of websites, all kinds of documentaries on TV, anthologies about the Beatles, Wikipedia to tell you about the Beatles. Many of you who are grandparents who lived through it can certainly explain to your kids and grandkids why that era was so great. So I'm not trying to tell you all about the Beatles as if you've never heard of them. You have many sources to be able to look it up for yourselves, including, well, let's start with this. Rubber Soul, woo! From 1966, I believe. That was the Beatles. Here's my mug, so I drink my coffee in my Beatles mug. We also have all kinds of things like Beatles DVDs. Many of the grandparents probably have these if they've saved them. You can also buy these on Amazon.com. But I'm not here to promote or to buy. I'm just telling you the things that you can look up so you can learn more about the Beatles. See, this was called the Beatles Anthology that came out with all sorts of, see, that's coming out, all sorts of presentations, film clips, the music. And of course, as we continue in this discussion, we'll talk about album covers and what we remember. Okay, so you know all that. But getting back to the reason that I'm talking about this is because I am here to explain that cultural era of early 1964 through the late 1960s when the Beatles came on the scene through the eyes and the ears of an 11-year-old Midwest preteen girl. Hey, who was an 11-year-old Midwest preteen girl? That was me. Yep. I had just turned 11 in February of 1964 when the Beatles first came on the scene to an American waiting nation on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was a big Sunday night variety show that would appear every week on CBS. And they said that it broke all the ratings records at the time when the Beatles came on. But did Americans even know about the Beatles? Most of the parents really weren't paying attention. But the young kids that would listen to their radio stations back then, which was AM and FM radio, oh my gosh, we heard the Beatles songs probably a good 6 months before that. So everybody was anticipating the four mop tops, as they called John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. To kind of put it in perspective for any of you kids that are the grandchildren watching this with grandma or grandpa perhaps, I can give one little example. If you're around the 11-year-old age range now and you're really into Taylor Swift, I know there are a lot of preteens, teens, college students, grown-ups, everybody who are just crazy for Taylor Swift. She's the big cultural icon right now. The Beatles, I'm telling you, it was a completely different time. We didn't have all the distractions of iPhones and social media. We didn't have internet. We didn't have any of that. So when they came on the scene, we first heard of them from our AM radio stations that were playing all over the country. So all I can say is that it would be similar to Taylor Swift appearing on the scene, but on steroids, okay? We had never heard music like this before. And so they came to America and appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. And that date was February 9th, 1964. Everybody was tuning in that Sunday night to watch and see the Beatles firsthand when they came to America. And they were doing a big tour after that. But in order for you to understand what I remember as an 11-year-old during that time, we have to go back a little bit in time. Not that far back, but we have to go back about 12 weeks. 13 weeks, couple months. We have to go back to understand very much what the cultural mindset and the tone of what Americans were going through. Because if you count back from the second week of February 1964, when the Beatles came on the scene, if you count back to November 22nd, 1963, you will know that the mood of our country was very, very sad and very unhappy, because for the first time in modern history, our young president, John F. Kennedy, who I'm sure many of you that are watching who are younger have learned about, listening to shows about that and learning about it in your history books, our young president, John Kennedy, was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. And we as a society and in the world had never experienced anything like this. I know today so many of us are anesthetized to gun violence, sadly. It's almost commonplace. But at that time, nothing, and I mean nothing other than Lincoln 100 years before then, had ever happened with a young, vibrant president like John Kennedy, who I remember. At that time, I was still 10 years old because I was turning 11 that following December. But I do remember the sense of sadness, the sense of just shock that was going on throughout our country and throughout the world that this young president had been shot. So the mood for that Thanksgiving, the mood of our country and the mood of everyone, including young people like myself, school was called off the following Monday for the funeral that was telecast nationwide on all the stations and in black and white at the time. It was a very sad Christmas time. It was a very sad time of national mourning. So to set the scene, and the reason I'm sharing this with you is that, yes, I do remember when Kennedy was shot. And I do know that when the Beatles music started to infiltrate in a good way on our AM radio stations that we would all listen to, it started to bring back a sense of joy. It's kind of like 9/11 when that happened, and the whole nation as a collective was very, very sad. The mood was very disheartened, and we didn't feel like we would ever get past it. But we started to, slowly but surely, and things moved forward as they always do. So when the Beatles came on the scene in 1964, that February, on TV, it completely lifted the mood. I won't say all together, but for at least us young people growing up, and I had siblings at the time that were also in their teenage years or in college, everybody was tuned into John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And before you knew it, we started to feel happy again because their music, especially the early years of their music, with albums such as Meet the Beatles, all the songs like She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand, those album covers, which I can pull up as we're talking about it, it'll help you recall maybe where you were in life. You might have been much older. Maybe some of you weren't even born, but that's okay. Just wanted you to understand that from an 11-year-old young girl's viewpoint like myself, they were the end all, the be all, they were everything. Little girls were dreaming about marrying John or Paul or George or Ringo. Little boys wanted to be just like them, and everybody wanted to grow their hair long like the mop top. As an 11-year-old who was totally enamored with John Lennon, I always dreamed that I was going to grow up and marry John Lennon, and that's all there was to it. Now, some of my girlfriends on our way to school, we'd be walking and talking about the Beatles because that's all we talked about. And they kept saying they wanted to marry Paul or they wanted to marry George. I was convinced. I said, I'm going to marry John Lennon. You have to go back in your mind being an 11-year-old, especially in those innocent times. But I was convinced and I was determined that I was going to grow up, get out of school, marry John Lennon. And one of my girlfriends said to me, but he's already married to Cynthia, which he was. And I said, I don't care. I'm going to marry him. And one of my Sunday school friends said to me, but the rabbi won't like it because he's not Jewish, because I grew up Jewish. And I said, I don't care, but don't tell the rabbi. I have a very fun memory of my dad. My dad's name was Coleman, and I was, when you're a little girl, you think of your parents as being like so old. He wasn't all that old, but he was very soft-spoken. But I remember we were sitting in our den watching our black and white TV, because in those days, everybody gathered around the TV, certainly to watch Ed Sullivan, and especially for that episode. And I remember my dad was very quiet, which he usually is. He was drinking his tea and watching me watching TV, and he was probably waiting for some other entertainment on TV, or at least the news, something like that. So he didn't say much, but I know he was paying attention. Anyway, the next day, the next morning, everybody was going to school, whether you had older siblings, they were on their way to high school or going to college, or in my case, a 6th grader getting ready to go to school. And in those days, at least in the neighborhood where I grew up, we didn't have a school bus necessarily. You could walk to school. If the weather was bad, maybe a parent would drive you to school. We also used to walk home for lunch back in those days, at least in my neighborhood and in my district. Long story short, my quiet, very soft-spoken father, Coleman, would take me to school in his old, get ready for this one, his old Ford Edsel station wagon. Yes, the station wagon that was called an Edsel by Ford back then. It was the latest car in the fleet, except that it probably was recalled, no doubt, because obviously it didn't last. You don't hear about the Edsel. But my dad was taking me to school that morning because it was February, it was snowing. That Monday it was cold out, so Daddy took me on his way to the downtown store where he worked. He took me to drop me off at my elementary school. And I was so excited because I couldn't wait to tell all my little friends about, did you watch the Beatles? Did you see Ed Sullivan? What did you think of their songs? A lot of the songs that they sang were like, She Loves You, yeah, 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 and I Want to Hold Your Hand. So my daddy is dropping me off, and I'm getting my little milk money. When I say, goodbye, Daddy, have a nice day, make a lot of money. I used to always joke with him when I was in 6th grade, make a lot of money at work today, Daddy, and he always laughed. This time I said, bye, Daddy, have a good day, make a lot of money. And in his quiet way, he turns to me, and guess what he said? 3 words. Are you ready? Yeah, yeah, yeah. My dad Kalman said, yeah, 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 which I was laughing so hard because it showed that he was paying attention to the Beatles like everybody else. I remember buying something called Beatles trading cards. They were a pack of cards, exactly like boys' baseball cards that you would have trading cards at the time, where you would trade certain players or whatever and learn about the stats on the back of the baseball cards. Well, they had Beatle trading cards when I was in 6th grade and 7th grade, and I will never forget going to Sunday school, which we did every Sunday, and my class of Sunday school pals, and all the girls were looking at their trading cards, not really paying too much attention to who the teacher at the time, but we were looking down at our trading cards and looking at the different Beatles and which ones were our favorite, because every girl, I am telling you without question, every girl had their favorite Beatle. There were 4 of them. Most of the girls around that time, well, they fell in love with Paul McCartney. Who's not to love Paul McCartney? He's so handsome. He was so cute. He was the lead singer at the time. Most of the girls were in love with Paul, and I like Paul very much too. And he's still alive to this day, which is incredible, really amazing. He's now in his 80s, so look at that. A lot of the girls loved Paul, and they wanted as many of the Paul McCartney trading cards as possible. A lot of girls loved Ringo because he was so cute and funny playing the drums. Ringo was just like that funny, like almost like an elf type who, is like the golden retriever of the band. And then, of course, George Harrison. Wow, everybody loved George. He was known as the quiet Beatle. And of course, we read our teen magazines, and we would stop at the store and try to, beg our parents to buy us Beatles lunch boxes, and there were Beatle wigs that they used to sell. But I remember in Sunday school, so that the teacher wouldn't notice, the girls and I in our class that would sit together in class on Sundays would kind of trade our Beatle trading cards. And I know that my favorite Beatle to this day, back then and always, was John Lennon. I always loved John Lennon. Everyone who knows me knows that, of course. So many of the girls wanted my Paul McCartney trading cards, and I wanted as many John trading cards as I could find, so we swapped, and I had more John Lennon cards than ever, and not enough girls had enough Paul McCartney cards. And I just remember whatever we were quizzed on or had a test on in Sunday school for that lesson in the Old Testament, it went by the wayside. But if someone had asked, who was your favorite Beatle or how many trading cards do you have, we could all answer very thoroughly. So that's a funny memory that I have. The music was wonderful. It was so upbeat. And I know that later on, as an adult, much later on, I decided to go visit England. And of course, you go on the tours of London. But I took 2 tours of Liverpool, where I took the train with a friend the first time. And then a few years later, I took it with another friend. Being in Liverpool, strawberry fields, the birthplace of all 4 of the Beatles, they have a Beatles museum there. It was an incredible experience because there were many, many artists, such as Cilla Black. She was a huge artist. Petula Clark. There were so many who were introduced with that same genre of music at the same time. It was known as the British Invasion. Why? The Beatles started it, but they definitely weren't the only ones. We had a lot of groups called the Dave Clark Five, the Animals, we had the Hollies. And I remember as a little girl at age 11, we would make a call to Miami Beach, Florida, because my grandmother, my mother's mother, so we're going way back in time, but my grandmother, who had an Eastern European accent because she came from the old country, I would call her. My daddy would hand me the phone, because back then you did not have your own phones. Oh my God, you wouldn't even dream of it. And not only did you not have your own phone, but there's usually only one phone. Maybe if you were lucky, there would be a downstairs phone and an upstairs phone. And your parents usually were the first ones and the only ones to be able to actually use the phone. But I remember we were talking to my grandmother, who lived in Miami Beach, and I got on the phone to wish her a happy Valentine's or whatever it was we were talking about. So I said to her, Grandma, did you watch the Ed Sullivan Show? Did you watch him last Sunday night on TV? And she goes, oh yes, Ed Sullivan, the Ed Sullivan Show. I watch every Sunday, with her Eastern European Polish accent. And I go, Grandma, it's not Ed Solomon, it's Ed Sullivan. And she goes, that's what I said, the Ed Sullivan Show. I watch every Sunday, Topo Gigio. We used to listen to music on a record player, which actually vinyl albums have come back in style now, which is amazing. And you would have a needle that would have to be replaced when it wore out. All of us kids, boy, as we were growing up, we listened to our music after school. You know, once we got home and got tired of the radio, we would go ahead and play our favorite albums. And the needle would have to be replaced on the vinyl record player because it would wear out from us playing it over and over. I also remember growing up, I wonder if a lot of you do too, how parents would scream, "Turn that racket down. Your music is too loud," because we didn't have access to headphones back then. So you would hear the vibration. At least my mother used to say, "Turn down that racket or I'm going to come up there and break your albums." And of course I turned it off right away. One more hilarious memory I have is that actually I was within breathing distance of John Lennon, who was at that time married to Yoko Ono. So now we're talking 1970. I was a senior in high school on a senior class trip to New York, and I had visited my brother who was living in Manhattan at the time. Long story short, my brother and I were walking down the street and walking near a newsstand. And all of a sudden, my brother stops us. He turns to me, points in front of me, and says, "Debbie, look over there. Look who you see. Do you see?" Sure enough, it was the 1970 version with his very long hair and his wife, John Lennon and Yoko Ono. And I absolutely was just dead silent. I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. I probably couldn't even remember my name at that point. But there he was. So my brother turned to me, and I'll never forget it. He said, "Debbie, this is your chance now. This is your dream. There he is. Do you want to go up to him and say something?" But I knew in my 17-year-old brain that no matter what I would try to say to John Lennon in that moment, no matter what, it would come out. I wouldn't even be able to form a sentence. So I looked at my brother and I said, "No." And he said back to me, "Good call, Debbie. I think that's smart." So I hope you enjoyed this episode. It's certainly not everything, but it's my everything from the eyes and the ears of an 11-year-old. Next week, we're going to be talking about the fashions of that era, and I have a lot to share with you about that. I hope you have a wonderful week, and we'll see you again next week. Take a look at the Beatles. Go look it up. I'll bet you anything Grandma and Grandpa can have a nice discussion about where they were during the time when the Ed Sullivan Show was on. And if not, go look it up and ask them questions. They'll love it. And hopefully it'll bring you some connection and some joy. Have a good week. See you next time. Bye.